The Dabney Coleman House stood quietly on a quiet street in the suburbs, a stately structure with a faded charm. It was a place that had witnessed decades of life, love, and loss. When Dabney Coleman, once a household name, his face etched into the fabric of Hollywood's golden era, passed away, the house took on a new life, carrying echoes of a past long gone. After his passing, the house sat empty for a while, a symbol of faded fame and lost memories. The furniture, much like his career, grew old and sagged under the weight of time. There were whispers in the neighborhood about the house. Some said it had a certain heaviness to it, a sense of abandonment that seeped into the air. But it wasn't until the new owners moved in that things began to take a darker turn. The new owners, a young couple, Lena and David, had bought the house at a reasonable price. The exterior was worn, the lawn a little too overgrown, but there was a charm to it, a sense of history. They were drawn to the house, not because of the stories surrounding it, but because it was spacious and full of character. For Lena, who was fascinated by old Hollywood, the idea of living in a place once occupied by someone so iconic was a thrill. But the excitement quickly faded. The first few days felt normal enough. They unpacked boxes, moved furniture into the sprawling rooms, and began the slow process of making the place their own. But it wasn't long before strange things began to happen. It started subtly. Objects would be slightly out of place. A chair moved just an inch or two, like someone had brushed past it. They shrugged it off as typical settling of an old house, the kind of thing that happens with age. Then came the sounds. It started in the late evening, the hours when the house was at its quietest. First, it was just footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps that would echo through the long hallways. Lena thought it was David, coming in from the garage or the backyard. But when she checked, he was always nowhere near. The steps grew more frequent, louder, as if someone were pacing the corridors in frustration. Sometimes, it sounded like a door opening, followed by the unmistakable squeak of hinges. But every time they investigated, the house was always still, the doors securely shut. One night, Lena was sitting in the study, reading, when she felt an inexplicable chill wash over her. The room, though comfortable, seemed suddenly suffocating. She glanced up and froze. On the wall across from her, the faintest outline of a figure seemed to manifest, an almost translucent shape that lingered for just a moment before disappearing. It was an old man's silhouette, tall and commanding, but also somehow worn with age. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she hurried out of the room, shaking her head as though trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. The days that followed were filled with more unsettling events. David began to hear a voice, low, gruff, but almost inaudible, like a conversation happening just outside his hearing range. He'd be alone in the kitchen, and he would catch snippets of what sounded like a one-sided dialogue. At first, he thought it was a neighbor, but as time passed, it became clear. There was no one else in the house. They weren't sure how to explain it. The house had no history of being haunted, not in any formal sense. There were no reports of strange deaths or tragic events tied to its past. Dabney Coleman had lived there in peace, as far as anyone knew, enjoying his privacy. But as the house settled into its new phase, it seemed to carry the weight of his legacy and perhaps something more. One evening, while Lena was cleaning out the attic, she came across an old box, buried beneath a pile of forgotten belongings. Inside, she found photographs, black and white pictures of Dabney Coleman, taken during his younger years, standing beside various people, always with a faint smile. But one photograph caught her eye. It was a shot of him sitting alone in the living room, his gaze distant, almost melancholic. There was something unsettling about it. His eyes seemed to follow her, even from the photograph. She placed the box down quickly, feeling an unease settle over her. But it wasn't just the photograph that unsettled her, it was the strange smell that had begun to permeate the house in the last few days. A faint, unmistakable scent of cigar smoke, mingled with the musty odor of old leather. It was a smell that made her heart race. That night, she dreamed of Dabney Coleman. In the dream, he was sitting in the living room of the house, alone as he had been in the photograph. But this time, his face was different. It was no longer the confident, charming actor that had once graced the screen. It was tired, haunted, as though the years had worn him down. His eyes locked onto hers, and in a whisper he said, "I never left." Lena awoke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. She lay awake for hours, the room filled with the sound of her own breath and the faint smell of cigars lingering in the air. The next day, things grew worse. Lena and David were arguing when the lights flickered, the bulbs buzzing ominously. The temperature dropped. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable. It was no longer just the strange noises, the glimpses of movement. It was something more, something that had been awakened in the house. The couple began to question whether the house was truly haunted, or if it was just the remnants of a man's legacy that refused to die. But as time wore on, the experiences became more frequent, more intense. The voices grew clearer. The footsteps became louder, and the figure Lena had seen in the attic seemed to return to the house every night. Sometimes, she would hear faint laughter, a man's laugh, echoing through the walls, laughter that sounded far too real to be a memory of the past. The house had become a prison of sorts, its walls closing in on them with every passing day. They knew they couldn't stay, not in a place so steeped in lingering spirits. But it wasn't just the haunting that scared them. It was the realization that perhaps Dabney Coleman, in some strange way, had never truly left. His presence, his essence clung to the house, and it would never release its grip. By the time they moved out, the house had grown more silent, as if it were content once again. The new owners who moved in after them would never know the history that the house held, never understand the weight of the man who had once lived there and whose spirit seemed unable to let go. But for Lena and David, the memories of the Dabney Coleman house would linger in their minds for years to come, like an unwelcome guest who had overstayed its welcome. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The new owners of the Dabney Coleman house, a young couple named Amanda and Keith, had heard the rumors before they signed the papers. Old houses, especially ones with a history as peculiar as this one, always came with stories, whispers of things that go bump in the night, or strange occurrences that lingered long after the past had faded. But Amanda and Keith weren't easily spooked. They were the sort of people who believed in the charm of old houses, the patina of history that could be found in every creaking floorboard and every drafty window. They had come across the house by accident, tired of the sterile, cookie-cutter homes they had seen in the suburbs. They were drawn to the vintage allure of the Coleman place. The house was sprawling, with multiple levels, long hallways, and large windows that let in the light at all hours of the day. It felt like a relic, something that had been untouched by time, and that was exactly what they wanted. The first few days in the house were filled with the typical chaos of moving and unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and arguing over paint colors. They joked about the odd squeaks in the floorboards, the slight drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, but chalked it all up to the house's age. After all, this was not their first old house, and they'd come to expect these little quirks. But there was something different about this place, a kind of heaviness in the air, an almost palpable stillness that was hard to ignore. At night, after the settling of the day, the house seemed to breathe with them, as if the walls themselves were alive, listening. Amanda had first noticed it one evening while she was alone in the library. The house had an impressive collection of old books, some of them antique first editions, some just faded paperbacks that had yellowed over the years. She sat in the large leather armchair, a glass of red wine in hand, looking through a photo album that she had found tucked away in a cabinet. The album was full of black and white images, candid shots of Dabney Coleman from his youth, pictures of him at movie premieres with colleagues, standing in front of iconic Hollywood landmarks. But there was one photo that caught her eye, one that seemed to draw her in. It was of him sitting at a grand piano, a deep frown etched on his face, his posture stiff, almost as though he was waiting for something or someone to enter the room. There was no smile, no warmth in his eyes. Instead, there was a darkness to him, a weariness that felt out of place among the glamorous photos. She stared at it for a long time, feeling an odd shiver run through her, as if the man in the photo was staring back at her, waiting for her to understand something. She shook it off and stood up to stretch her legs. That's when she heard it, the soft creak of floorboards from upstairs. It was unmistakable, the kind of sound that only old wood could make. Her heart gave a little jump in her chest. She had assumed Keith was up there, maybe moving something around in the guest room or poking around in the attic. But when she called out to him, there was no answer. The house fell silent, save for the whisper of the wind outside. Amanda hesitated for a moment, then decided to investigate. She made her way up the winding staircase, the air growing colder the higher she climbed. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, with only the soft light from the streetlights outside filtering through the curtains. As she passed by the guest room, she noticed that the door was ajar, slightly more than she had left it earlier that day. Her pulse quickened. She pushed the door open slowly, expecting to find Keith maybe searching through a box or messing with some of the furniture they hadn't yet put in place. But the room was empty. A faint smell lingered in the air, cigar smoke. Not the fresh kind, but the kind that had been trapped in a room for years, so faint and pervasive that it clung to the fabric of the room itself. She frowned. She hadn't seen any evidence that Keith smoked cigars. And even if he had, it was odd that the scent would be so strong in a room they hadn't even used yet. She stepped into the room, the floor creaking under her weight, and glanced around. The large window was open just a crack, and the curtains fluttered lightly in the evening breeze. Her eyes moved across the room, landing on the vintage dresser by the far wall. For a moment, she thought she saw something in the reflection of the mirror, something that wasn't there before. It was a shadow, or maybe just the dim light playing tricks on her eyes. But the longer she stared, the more it seemed to move. She blinked, her heart racing. But when she looked again, the reflection was normal. No shadow, no figure. Still unsettled, she turned to leave, but just as she was about to step out of the room, she heard it. A soft, low whisper, almost like a breath at the back of her neck. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. But there was no one there. Keith was still downstairs, nowhere near the room. She stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but nothing felt right. There was a presence in the house, something she couldn't explain, something she couldn't shake. It wasn't malevolent, at least not at first, but it was there. Always watching, always lingering. Over the next few days, the house seemed to settle into its own rhythm. The noises became more frequent, footsteps that echoed through the hallways at odd hours of the night, a door that would creak open on its own, the sound of something shifting in the attic when no one was up there. Keith began to hear the voice too. It was low, almost imperceptible, but there was a tone to it that made his skin crawl. Sometimes it would speak in a language he didn't understand, words that seemed old, ancient, and yet strangely familiar, like a memory he couldn't quite place. One evening, after Amanda had gone to bed, Keith was alone in the living room. The large space felt empty, despite the furniture that filled it. He sat in one of the old armchairs, a glass of bourbon in hand, staring at the dim light of the fireplace as the flames flickered. That's when he felt it, the pressure, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The air grew heavy, and for a moment the temperature dropped. He glanced up at the staircase that led to the second floor, the shadows there growing deeper, more pronounced. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was a man, tall, with a broad frame, dressed in clothes from another era, an old-fashioned suit, perhaps with a bow tie. But it wasn't the clothes that made Keith freeze. It was the way the figure moved, slow and deliberate, as if it was stepping down the stairs but without actually touching the ground. It was like watching a ghost glide through the air, the contours of the figure distorted, flickering in and out of clarity. Keith's heart raced, his hand tightening around the glass in his hand. He stood up, intending to call out to Amanda, but when he looked back at the stairs, the figure was gone. The house was still, but the air felt thick with an unspoken tension, a reminder that something was waiting, something tied to the house's past, and that it wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The days that followed grew increasingly strange, and Amanda and Keith found themselves drawn deeper into the house's disquieting rhythm. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against their chests, making it hard to breathe in the evening. The house no longer felt like a home, Not in the way it had when they first moved in, with its potential for warmth and charm. Instead, it felt like a place that existed outside of time, a place where the boundaries between the past and present were perpetually blurred. There was a sense of waiting in the house, waiting for something to happen, or for something to return, as if it was only a matter of time before the house demanded something in return for the history it carried. Amanda began to feel the weight of it more heavily, especially at night. The darkness seemed to swallow the house whole, stretching through every room, wrapping around her like a heavy cloak. Sleep became elusive, her nights filled with vague unease that left her tossing and turning beneath the sheets. On more than one occasion, she awoke in the middle of the night, staring into the deep blackness of their bedroom, certain that she wasn't alone. It wasn't the typical kind of fear that came from being in an unfamiliar place, but something else entirely, something primal. A deep-rooted sense of being watched, being observed by something she couldn't quite see but knew was there. One particular night, after several sleepless evenings, Amanda decided to confront the feeling head-on. She had heard the rumors from neighbors, the whispers of Dabney Coleman's presence still lingering in the house, even after his death. They had laughed it off at first, attributing it to overactive imaginations, but the more she thought about it, the more she couldn't deny that something wasn't right. There was an energy in the house, a tension that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Keith had been working late, and she found herself alone once again in the vast, silent house. She was standing in the grand foyer, looking up at the intricate banister that curled up to the second floor, her gaze traveling over the worn steps that led to the darkened hallway above. The house had a way of feeling enormous in the quiet, the silence amplifying every small creak, every subtle shift in the wood beneath her feet. It was in these moments, when everything was still, that she felt the weight of the house pressing in on her, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The faint scent of cigar smoke lingered in the air once again, curling its way around her, and she stiffened. It was impossible to ignore now. It wasn't a fleeting whiff or the smell of something old buried in the fabric of the house. It was persistent, like it was coming from somewhere in the room with her. She turned slowly, as if expecting to see someone standing just behind her, but there was no one. The air around her felt colder, the edges of the room darkening, as though the shadows were creeping in from the corners. She swallowed, her throat dry, and tried to shake off the feeling. Her footsteps echoed softly as she crossed the foyer, drawn toward the large wooden door that led to the study. It was a room she had avoided since they'd moved in, a room that had never quite felt right to her. It wasn't as if there was anything particularly eerie about it. It was simply an old, unused space with bookshelves stacked high and a large, dark desk in the center of the room. But every time she walked past the door, she felt a pull, a magnetic draw to enter, to understand what was waiting inside. She hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The scent of old wood and dust hit her immediately, mingling with the cigar smoke that seemed to be growing stronger. The room was bathed in the faint light of a single lamp on the desk, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her as she entered. Her eyes moved over the shelves of books, the faint remnants of old magazines scattered across the table, the papers strewn across the desk as though someone had left in a hurry. But it was the mirror on the far wall that caught her attention. It was an old mirror, framed in tarnished gold, its surface cloudy with age. The reflection was dim, distorted, as though it didn't want to give up its secrets. As she stepped closer, Amanda felt an odd compulsion to look deeper into the glass, to see what it might reveal. The longer she stared, the more the reflection seemed to warp, as if the room behind her wasn't quite as solid as it should be. Her heart began to beat faster, an instinctual warning signaling that something was wrong. The shadows in the mirror grew darker, more pronounced, until they almost seemed to move on their own. Suddenly, she caught a glimpse of something in the reflection, a shape, standing just behind her, in the dim light of the room. It wasn't Keith. It wasn't anyone she recognized. It was a figure, tall and thin, dressed in the same old-fashioned suit she had seen in the photos. The face was obscured, hidden in the shadows, but she could feel its presence. The air in the room seemed to freeze, and Amanda's breath caught in her throat. She turned quickly, But the room was empty. No one was there. Her pulse raced, and for a moment, she couldn't move. The weight of the silence in the room was suffocating, and she felt a chill creeping down her spine. The cigar smoke, which had been so thick moments before, seemed to dissipate, leaving behind only the scent of old wood and dust. She forced herself to look back at the mirror, but the figure was gone. All that remained was her own reflection, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at her with a mixture of disbelief and dread. As she stepped backward, her heel caught on the edge of the rug, and she stumbled, her hand reaching out to steady herself. But just as her fingers brushed against the desk, the air shifted, and the whispering began. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur that she couldn't quite make out, but then it grew louder, clearer, until the words became distinct. "I never left." The voice was low, hushed, like a secret shared between old friends. But it wasn't the voice of a friend. It was the voice of something older, something that had waited long enough to be heard again. Amanda spun around, but the room was empty. The whisper lingered in her ears, filling her mind with images of things she couldn't understand. She backed out of the study quickly, her breath coming in short gasps, the weight of the house pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible hand. When she found Keith later that night, she didn't mention what had happened. She couldn't. The words felt impossible to form, the fear too raw to share. She simply told him she was tired, that the house was starting to get to her. He nodded, as he always did, and tucked her into bed, unaware of the growing sense of unease that was beginning to settle in the very bones of their home. But Amanda knew, deep down, that something had been awakened, something that had never fully left the house, lingering in the cracks between the walls and the spaces between the seconds, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. And that moment, Amanda realized, was fast approaching. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.